I pretended to be blind for 6 months. What my wife did on day 3 changed everything. Elias Booker was 39 years old, and for 6 months, he let the entire world believe he had lost his sight. He was a forensic engineer who wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation, drove a 15-year-old pickup with a cracked taillight he kept meaning to fix, and carried his lunch to the job site in a dented steel box every single morning. His wife's friends called him Sweet, Simple Eli, and in 11 years of marriage, Sabrina had never once corrected them. Then a pressure line failed at the Dunmore plant and put a wall of superheated steam across his face, and the doctors at the hospital in Richmond told his wife, gently, that his vision might never come back. It came back in 11 days. He told no one, because on the 3rd day, while the whole house believed he was sitting helpless in the dark, he heard Sabrina in the next room, her voice low and certain and almost tender, explaining to a man named Grant exactly how quickly the courts would let her be named guardian of a blind man who could no longer read his own paperwork. There was $480,000 in settlement money on the table that week, and there was something else she had only just discovered while going through the drawers she assumed he could no longer see her open. 3 patents with his name on them. What Sabrina never thought to ask, not once in all those years, was what a man who had spent his entire life reading the hidden cracks inside things, the fractures that announce a collapse long before the collapse comes, might notice about his own home when everyone around him assumed he could see nothing at all. He did not confront her. He kept his eyes soft and unfocused, learned to let her guide his hand to the coffee cup, and began, very quietly, to build. What happened over the 6 months that followed would cost Sabrina everything she believed a closed pair of eyes had handed her. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. To understand what those 6 months cost her, you have to understand the man Sabrina married and the man she thought she had married, and just how far apart those 2 men had drifted without her ever once looking up to notice. The house on Bellamy Road had been a wreck when Elias bought it. Sagging joists, a foundation that breathed when the seasons changed, a back wall that had quietly begun to pull away from the rest of the structure 1/8 of an inch at a time. Everyone else saw a teardown. Elias saw a thing that could be made sound again if a man was patient enough to listen to it. He spent 4 years rebuilding it with his own hands, replacing the rotted sills, jacking the floors back to level, laying the kitchen tile himself 1 slow row at a time until the lines ran true in every direction. That kitchen was the truest thing he owned. He ran his palm along the counter the way other men touched the hoods of cars. His grandmother Odessa had raised him in a narrow house 2 streets over after his mother passed and his father drifted off somewhere that mail never reached. She had been a woman of few words and enormous certainty, and she had given him the single sentence he carried into every room for the rest of his life. Trust what a thing does, she used to tell him, not what it says. A floor will tell you it's failing long before it gives out. You just have to be willing to put your ear against the wall and stay quiet long enough to hear it. He had stayed quiet his whole life. It was the most useful skill he owned, and the most invisible. Only 2 people in the world knew the full shape of what Elias actually was. His attorney, Phyllis Ardrey, a silver-haired woman who had handled estates and litigation in that city for 31 years, and an old colleague at a structural firm in Atlanta who licensed his sensor designs because the real Elias Booker held 3 patents on a strain monitoring system that quietly lived inside the steel of bridges and parking structures across 4 states, and those patents had paid him a royalty every quarter for the better part of a decade. He never spent it. He let it gather in an account Sabrina had no reason to know existed, because the man she married drove a cracked truck and clipped coupons and never, ever talked about money. He still carried the small audio recorder he used to log his site inspections, a habit her great-uncle Sterling had drilled into him years before. "Document everything," Sterling always said. "The record is the only witness that never changes its story." He had met Sabrina at a hardware store on a Saturday 11 years earlier. She had been standing in the lighting aisle, holding two nearly identical fixtures and frowning at them like they had insulted her, and he had told her, quietly, that the cheaper one would outlast the expensive one because it was built simpler, and simpler things break less. She had laughed, surprised, and asked if he always knew what would last and what wouldn't. Back then, she had looked at him like he was a kind of safety. Back then, before the laughter went thin and the looking stopped, he had believed her. In the last year, though, the small things had started to drift out of true. A new perfume she never mentioned buying, a phone that tilted away from him at the dinner table and lit up at hours that made no sense, a closeness that had calcified into politeness, the kind of politeness people offer a man they have already decided is furniture. He noticed. He noticed everything. He simply hadn't decided yet what the noticing meant. Then came the morning at the Dunmore plant, and the steam, and the dark, and the 11 days in which Elias Booker discovered exactly what kind of house he had been living in all along. His sight returned slowly, the way light returns to a room when a cloud finally moves off the sun. By the third day, he could make out the shapes of things, the grain of the ceiling, the line of his own hand against the blanket. He kept that to himself out of an instinct he couldn't yet name. And it was that instinct, that stillness, that let him hear the conversation that ended his marriage. Sabrina was in the kitchen he had built, the one he could now dimly see, and she did not lower her voice nearly enough, because to her he was a blind man asleep in a recliner down the hall. She was talking to Grant Mercer. Elias did not know the name yet, but he learned it that morning, said warm and familiar in his wife's mouth. Grant was a wealth advisor with a downtown condo, a leased Porsche, and a way of speaking about other people's money that sounded like generosity. Sabrina was telling him that the timing was finally right, that a blind man can't read what he signs, that a guardianship petition, filed correctly with the right doctor's letter, would give her control of the settlement and everything attached to it within 90 days, that she'd found patents in his desk, that there was apparently real money, more than she had ever imagined, and that nobody would question a devoted wife stepping in to manage the affairs of a husband who could no longer manage them himself. Elias lay in that recliner with his eyes half closed and listened to the woman he had rebuilt a house for explain, calmly, how she intended to dismantle him. His hands did not shake. That was the first thing he noticed about himself, and it told him more than the conversation did. He felt the way he felt standing in front of a fractured support beam, that cold professional clarity that arrived when the time for feeling was over and the time for measuring had begun. He did not get up. He did not make a sound. He let her finish her coffee and kiss him on the forehead on her way out the door, and he let her tell him to rest. "Sweetheart," and he said, in the flat, careful voice of a man learning the dark, that he would. Then he sat in his own living room and began to build a timeline. He reached, slowly, for the small recorder in the pocket of his robe, the one he was never without, and from that morning forward, it was always running. Over the next 2 weeks, he learned to move through the house like a man who could not see while seeing everything. He learned the exact angles that kept his eyes from giving him away. He learned that Sabrina spoke freely on the phone when she believed she had no audience, and that Grant came to the house on Tuesday afternoons, and that the two of them had stopped being careful at all, because what is the point of being careful around furniture? He went back through the accounts. The pattern was older than the accident. Small transfers, 16 of them, $11,000 total, moved out across the previous 14 months into an account he didn't recognize. A meeting with an estate attorney she had taken while telling him she was at her sister's. A folder, hidden badly in the back of her closet, that he photographed with a camera she was certain he could no longer use. She had not started planning when he lost his sight. She had started planning long before, and his blindness had simply handed her the lever she had been waiting for. She had no idea that the blind man counting the days in his recliner had spent 20 years learning to find the exact point where a structure had begun to fail. On the 14th day, Elias did one small, deliberate thing. He picked up his phone, dialed a number he knew by heart, and when Phyllis Ardrey answered, he said, very quietly, that he could see, that he was going to keep that to himself for a while, and that he needed her to start a file. Then he hung up, and he set the phone down, and he let the silence of the house settle back over him like dust. A crack doesn't announce itself. You learn to read the signs, and then you decide, on your own time, when to let the building know it's coming down. Phyllis Ardrey's office sat above a shuttered bank downtown, all dark wood and old certainty, and Elias arrived for their first real meeting in a medical transport van, so that no one watching the house would wonder why a blind man had driven himself anywhere. He walked in on the arm of a hired aide, eyes vacant, and the moment the door closed he straightened, met Phyllis's gaze directly, and laid the recorder and a thumb drive on her desk. She listened to 40 minutes of it without speaking. When it ended, she removed her glasses, folded them, and looked at him for a long moment. "You understand," she said, "that the strongest position you have is the one she doesn't know you're standing in." "I understand," he said. "Then, we don't rush." She slid a legal pad toward herself. "We let her file. We let her build the whole thing on a foundation that isn't there. And when she's standing on it, fully committed, in front of the people whose opinion she cares about, we show everyone at once that the man at the center of it was never blind a single day past the second week. Some plans are built loud. The best ones are built in quiet rooms." The second meeting that mattered happened at a fish house on the river, where her great-uncle Sterling had eaten the same lunch every Friday for 30 years. Sterling was 81, sharp as a chisel, and the closest thing Elias had to a father since Odessa passed. Elias told him everything across a basket of hush puppies, and the old man listened with his jaw working slowly and his eyes going flat and hard. When Elias finished, Sterling was quiet a long while. Then he said the thing that Elias would carry all the way to the end. "A man who waits isn't weak," Sterling said. "A man who waits is the only kind dangerous enough to matter. When you move too soon, you get a reaction. When you wait, you get the whole truth. And the truth is the only weapon nobody can argue you out of." Then Sterling gave him the piece he didn't have. He knew Grant Mercer, not personally, but by reputation, the way old men in a small city know everyone. Grant had advised a widow in Sterling's church 3 years back, a Mrs. Pelham, and that woman had signed her savings into a trust Grant managed and had not seen a clean accounting since. There had been complaints. There had been a quiet inquiry. Nothing had stuck, because Mrs. Pelham had been too ashamed and too frightened to push. Elias took that name home with him like a tool he intended to use. Over the following weeks, with Phyllis pulling public filings and a forensic accountant she trusted following the paper, the other side of the picture came into focus. Grant Mercer had a pattern. He found women with assets and incapacitated husbands or aging parents, positioned himself as the steady hand, and routed money into vehicles that he alone controlled. The trust he was quietly steering Sabrina toward, the one meant to hold Elias's settlement and royalties once she had guardianship, was structured exactly like the one that had hollowed out Mrs. Pelham. There was a forged co-signature on one filing. There were management fees that went nowhere. It was, to a man who read structures for a living, the same fracture appearing in the same place under the same load. Grant didn't even bother changing the design. Then, 3 weeks before the hearing, the thing escalated. Sabrina came home one evening, sat on the arm of his chair, took his hand in both of hers, and told him in the softest voice she owned that there were just a few small papers to sign. Nothing to worry about, sweetheart, routine. She would guide his hand to the line. She had a witness coming, she said, a notary, a friend of Grant's. Elias asked, in the careful, empty voice he had perfected, what the papers were for. For the bills, she told him. So she could handle things while he healed. He let her fold his fingers around the pen. He let her move his hand to where she said the line was. And he signed a careful, useless scrawl 2 inches off the mark, the signature of a man who truly could not see. And he felt her flinch at how wrong it looked. And he heard her tell the notary they would try again another day. That night he called Phyllis and described the document Sabrina had left on the counter, which he had read in full the moment the house emptied. It was not for the bills. It was a durable power of attorney, predated, drafted in Grant's office. She had just handed him the last beam he needed. He thanked her at breakfast for taking such good care of everything. And all the while, Elias went home and was blind. This was the coldest work of all. He let Sabrina cut his food. He let her read his mail aloud, editing as she went, and he nodded at her edited version. He let her bring Grant into the house and introduce him as a financial counselor here to help, and he shook Grant Mercer's hand with the soft, uncertain grip of a man feeling for something he cannot see. And he said it was good of him to come. He memorized the man's voice. He memorized the smell of his cologne. He sat in his own kitchen, on his own true-laid tile, and let the two of them plan his disappearance over his head, as though he were already gone. That night, after the house went still, Elias sat alone in the dark he no longer needed, and felt nothing he would call rage. He felt the patience of a man who has found the load-bearing flaw and is only to wait for the inspection date. Preparation is the work. Everything after it is just arrival. The guardianship hearing was set for a Thursday morning in a mediation room at the courthouse annex, and Sabrina walked in believing it was a formality. Her attorney was there. Grant was there, in a suit too good for the room, seated just behind her like a partner. Her sister Renata had come, and so had 2 of the friends who called him Simple Eli, there to witness the sad, dignified moment a loyal wife took up the burden of a broken husband. A doctor's letter sat in the file. The petition was clean. Everyone in that room expected the next 30 minutes to be paperwork. Elias was brought in last, on the aide's arm, eyes unfocused, moving with the careful shuffle they had all grown used to. He let them seat him. He let Sabrina reach over and pat his hand. And then Phyllis Ardrey stood and asked the mediator's permission to enter several items into the record before the petition proceeded. And the temperature in the room began, very slowly, to change. She laid the first document on the table. Bank records, the 16 transfers, $11,000 moved out over 14 months, dated and traced, beginning long before any accident. She laid the second one down. The estate attorney's appointment, the one Sabrina had attended while claiming to be at her sister's. The third, photographs of the hidden folder. The fourth, the forensic accountant's summary of the trust Grant Mercer had designed, set beside the near-identical structure of the trust that had emptied Mrs. Pelham's accounts. The forged co-signature circled in red. Sabrina's attorney began to object. Phyllis simply set down the recorder and pressed play. Sabrina's own voice filled the room. A blind man can't read what he signs. 90 days. There's real money. More than I ever imagined. Nobody questions a devoted wife. The friends who had called him Simple Eli were no longer looking at Sabrina. They were looking at the floor. Then Phyllis said the sentence that brought the whole building down. For the record, she said, the respondent has had functional vision since the 11th day after his injury. He has been documenting these proceedings, in full, for 6 months. He is a licensed forensic engineer, the holder of 3 active patents, and he is entirely capable of managing his own affairs. He has simply been waiting for everyone in this room to finish showing him who they are. Elias raised his eyes. For the first time in that room, he looked directly at his wife and let her see that he saw her, had always seen her, had watched every move she made from inside a darkness she built for him and that he had calmly chosen to wear. Sabrina's face went through it in stages, the way concrete goes through it. Confidence, confusion, the first hairline of fear. Then the full understanding spreading outward all at once. She reached for the only tool she had left and began to cry, to say it had been Grant's idea, that she had been frightened, that she had only wanted to protect him, that he had to understand. It was her sister Renata who ended it. Renata stood, picked up her purse, and said, in a voice flat as a closed door, "Don't. I drove you here. I won't do it again." And she walked out, and the sound of that door was louder than anything Sabrina had said. Elias stood. He buttoned his jacket. He gathered the recorder and slid it into his pocket where it had always lived. And he looked once around the room, at Grant, who would not meet his eyes, and at the woman he had married in the hardware store a lifetime ago. "I spent 20 years learning to find the exact spot where a thing has started to fail," he said, and his voice never rose. "Long before anyone else can see it. You should never have built your plan inside a man who reads cracks for a living. I'm not angry, Sabrina, I'm clear. Those are different things." Then he walked out, and he did not look back, and behind him the room stayed silent over the paperwork that mapped, line by line, the precise shape of her collapse. 8 months had passed like water. The new place sat on a quiet rise outside the city. A small sound house with good bones that Elias had bought for the view of the trees and was slowly, happily, making true. He had built a deck off the back himself, board by board, and on this particular morning he was sanding the rail by hand in the early light, the way Odessa had taught him. Slow and even, and without hurry. The coffee on the rail was still warm. The maple he'd planted in the spring had taken and was holding its leaves against a light wind. Diana came out with a second cup. She was an architect who had hired his firm to assess an old mill she wanted to save, and she had asked careful, intelligent questions and had not once performed for him, and somewhere in the months of that work, the asking had become something quieter and steadier than either of them had planned. She set the cup beside his, said the rail was looking good, and went back in. She never crowded the morning. He had learned to recognize the rare people who let a thing simply be what it was. He had taken the patents public-facing at last, brought 2 younger engineers under him, and signed a contract that sprang worth more than the house in Richmond had ever been. He'd quietly funded a small legal aid line for elderly people targeted in guardianship and trust schemes, and named it for a woman in his late grandmother's church. The work felt like the truest thing he'd built since the kitchen tile. The news of the others reached him the way such news does, sideways, through people who knew people. The guardianship petition had been dismissed and sealed. The divorce had gone the only way it could. Sabrina had lost the friends who called him Simple Eli, and she had lost Renata, who did not call anymore. She was selling cosmetics from a counter at a mall 3 counties over and living in a rented room. Grant Mercer's name had finally caught up with him. The inquiry that never stuck the first time had stuck this time, with Mrs. Pelham no longer too ashamed to speak. And the last anyone heard, he was facing charges in 2 jurisdictions and would not be advising anyone on their money for a very long time. Elias heard all of it. He registered each piece the way he registered a reading on a gauge, noted it, and set it down. There was no satisfaction in it that he could find, and he had stopped looking for any. Bitterness, he had decided, was just an investment in people who no longer deserved the interest. He finished the rail, ran his palm down its length to feel for any place still rough, and found none. The morning came up gold over the maple. Diana's cup sat steaming beside his own. He had spent 6 months sitting in the dark on purpose, and in all his life, with 2 good eyes wide open, he had never once seen more clearly than he had in that dark. He picked up his coffee, still warm, and he was free, and he was solvent, and he was, at long last, entirely unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.